Hey fellow gamers, Chatty Sisa here. 007 First Light PC specs are out for a while, but a couple of people highlighted originally that some of them made no sense. And if you looked at the combination of the GPUs and VRAMs, for example, it was clear that these just don't match. Seeing what's posted on Steam only, it's not so obvious, as for some reason some of the specs are still missing there to this day, which were already listed by IOI themselves. So let's have a look at the whole mess and the currently released specs which are out there. Now, IOI released a statement lately that they've updated the list of the hardware requirements, but those still don't offer all the answers, even though they don't look so blatantly off anymore. Which, by the way, was one of the reasons I wasn't making an update vid about this so far, as I was waiting whether there will be a correction. What is surprising is that IOI posted the statement already on the 15th of January, and yet, for example, the VRAM details are still not available on Steam, which were one of those specs where some players spotted the inconsistencies and the misalignment previously. The statement says, "We are providing today an update to the PC system requirements for 007 First Light after the community flagged some inconsistencies in an earlier version of the listing. The earlier mistake was due to an internal miscommunication leading to an older version of the specs to be shared." As written in a reply by one of the players, an older version of the specs does not explain listing hardware that does not exist. A good example is the listed RTX 3060 Ti under the recommended hardware, where the original specs listed 12GB of VRAM necessary, but this GPU never had that. The same was under the minimum requirements, where our good old potato, the GTX 1660, never even had 8GB. It has 6 of GDDR5 VRAM. The Super version does use GDDR6, but still only has 6GB, so it's a mystery how IOI came up with the minimum requirement of 8. Originally, the recommended RAM was also listed, for example, at 32GB. Now it's corrected down to 16GB, which makes more sense from the listed hardware perspective, but it's kind of weird when you look at the minimum and the recommended being the same. So it just still feels a bit off, and the real question is on what settings those 1080p 60 FPS will be actually achieved. When I look at the specs for the minimum requirements, it isn't exactly clear whether you'd have to use an SSD or an HDD would be still fine, especially considering the previously mentioned old hardware potatoes listed under the minimum requirements. I know, most new games these days require SSD, and it's just mandatory, not just for the flawless transitions between gameplay and cinematics, but in general for keeping the load times as short as possible and to avoid game freezes. But still, it's not specified, which is normally part of the specs these days. Also, quite the amusing part for me was to list the Intel discrete GPU equivalent in those specs, so clearly either IOI didn't want to bother to figure it out on their own, or it's still a requirement assembled together by the same person that listed the original nonsense. Go figure. Now, the player feedback hasn't been, let's say, kind so far. Many are asking about the specs for settings like 1440p or 4K. But considering that this is a title that was clearly designed for the consoles, which would possibly explain the confused first PC specs that were just announced based on the components being the equivalents of the console, but nobody clearly checked whether they make sense from a PC perspective. I'm talking about the CPU-GPU combos here. I don't think that 4040p or 4K is something IOI has even considered. I mean, look at the minimum requirements. If the game can run on the GeForce GTX 1660, then I highly doubt you'll be able to squeeze out more than 1080p and 60 FPS from the game, which was stated for the recommended requirements. But you never know. We'll have to wait probably until they add more info or until the game is out. I think the most funny comment I've read on those specs was saying 007 FPS first refund, and another one less funny and more realistic was 32 GBs of RAM would be the kiss of death for the game in the current RAM shortage, which I wholeheartedly agree with. Those that don't have yet a 32 GB RAM probably won't be able to afford a new one anytime soon, so fewer paying customers than if that requirement would have stayed. So what are the current minimum and recommended PC hardware requirements? You can see that on the screen the minimum is performance target 1080p and 30 FPS, the recommended one is 1080p 60 FPS. The processor is Intel Core i5 9500 or AMD Ryzen 5 3500, and for the recommended it's Intel Core i5 13500 or AMD Ryzen 5 7600. As for the graphics card, it's the NVIDIA GeForce GTX 1660 as mentioned before, or AMD RX 5700, or the Intel discrete GPU equivalent on the minimum requirements, and for the recommended hardware requirements it's the NVIDIA GeForce RTX 3060 Ti or AMD RX 6700 XT. And of course again the Intel discrete GPU equivalent. As for the RAM, we are talking here about 16 GB on the minimum as well as on the recommended settings, and regarding the VRAM, which was previously already mentioned, it's now toned down to reflect the reality of either 6 GB on the minimum hardware requirements and 8 GB on the recommended. The storage is the same, 80 GB for both the minimum and recommended of course, and the operating system will be Microsoft Windows 10 or 11 64-bit version. In general, let's not forget the game is releasing by the end of May, specifically on the 27th of May, so just under 4 months from now, and by now it would have been nice to see the exact details without this weird misalignment and or missing specs. But what do you think of this whole post from IOI and what's going on with the hardware requirements? Are you, by the way, going to play the game on PC or rather on console after this fiasco? Let me know in the comment section below, it'll be interesting to read the feedback in this case for sure. And if you liked the video, don't forget to hit the like button or subscribe, it would be much appreciated. Thank you very much for watching, stay tuned and game on!